Hello, my needle drops. I have quite the review for you today. Before we get into it though, two things I want to mention. We hit the 11K in terms of subs. Yeah! And the second thing I want to mention before I get into this review is that I was on Norwegian television, believe it or not. And there's a link down there in the D-box where you can watch the episode I was on. This is Squarepusher's Shobaleader One, the demonstrator. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, I fail at life. What are you gonna do? When I was a little needle drop, and I didn't like electronic music, Squarepusher, or Tom Jenkinson, became that gateway, became that bridge for me to jungle and drum and bass and techno and numerous subgenres. So I kind of feel like I owe a little bit to this guy because of my musical tastes, but let's stop hero worshipping and start reviewing. So there's been a lot of talk about this LP, and what's surprising for me is that it's mostly talk from the fans, and the fans are saying this thing is coming out of left field, this thing is totally out of character for Squarepusher. However, I would argue that there were baby steps up until this point. Leading up to this LP was the album Just a Souvenir, which was explained by Tom as being the result of a dream or fantasy about a futuristic rock band with weird powers. And this album was basically kind of a rough sketch of what that band would sound like. Well, this album happened because of a group of musicians looking to collaborate with Jenkinson. So he basically took the opportunity to make this fantasy band a reality. And in terms of who Tom is working with on this album, he is not naming names. The most info he's given up is through a Q&A on Warp Records, where he says most of them come from a metal background. And that's not hard to believe considering the last track of this album, Maximum Plunk. That one has lots of chugging thrash metal chords, dissonant keys, and it all kind of builds up into these electrified black metal blast beats. But that track is just kind of an anomaly on this album. Most of the songs here do have a cohesive sound, and that sound being these robotic reinterpretations of funk, smooth jazz, R&B, and a little bit of rock as well. But what I think is mostly going on here is Jenkinson is just feeling out the possibility of this band and just printing their highs, their lows, and kind of everything in between. Just seeing what works out and what doesn't. You've got a couple of heavier tracks on here, one of them being the song Laser Rock, which I dug quite a bit. Thin drums, lots of spacey keys, heavy robot vocals. And what was funny about this track and many of the tracks on the album is that everything is so synthetic, especially the guitars. And the sound of this track and a couple of others on this album has garnered some comparisons to Daft Punk for this album, and though I can see it, I wouldn't really say Shobaleader One shoots for the same atmosphere that Daft Punk is. Some of my favorite tracks on this thing are actually the softer ones, like the song FRISCO Wave, just synthesizers that swell over and over and over in the mix. Lots of dry guitar, just very pretty atmosphere surrounding this track. It sounds like sitting on a beach at night in space. And I love the opener of this LP too. It's just so synthetic, but there's a lot of softness and there's a lot of subtlety there too. It's like listening to robots with emotions. But it's time to get to the gripes on this thing. And it is a major gripe. Something that ruins most of the songs on this thing for me. The mixing, the sound, is so bad in most cases. I don't mind vocoder vocals, I don't mind vocal effects, I don't mind talk box vocals, but here the vocals are just mixed so high that they're overpowering everything else in the mix, and it's so disruptive to me. And the next thing that ruins many of these tracks for me, especially the louder tracks, especially the rock tracks, is the sound of the guitar. I mean, yeah, it is really processed, it is really digital, but the sound is so tinny. It's like listening to 1,000 tiny little chainsaws tearing apart my skull at once. Don't get me wrong, on this LP I do like that Squarepusher doesn't stretch beyond the physical abilities of a real live band. I like that the songs here are more straightforward. I like that there's more of a focus on songwriting instead of heavy editing. There's some really great interplay between the instruments on this album too. Even though there are some tracks here that I do love and can go back to again and again, I feel like I'm observing here more than I am enjoying. To be completely honest, I'm really feeling about a strong 5 to a light 6 on this album, but that's just my opinion, and I really want to know from the Squarepusher fans, what do you think of this album? Are you in love with it? Do you hate it? And why? And where do you think Squarepusher is going to go from here? If there's an album or a track you'd like for me to review, let me know in the comments below. And that's the review, guys. Squarepusher, Shobaleader One, the Demonstrator,